Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have an 8-game slate for college basketball. We have some pretty good games. Almost all these games are pretty tightly contested, with one exception. Houston and Tulsa looks like it will potentially be a blowout, but it's also one of the lowest scoring games on the slate. So every other game is within a margin of a few points. So I do have my picks for these games. I have UConn over Villanova. I have Auburn over Florida. I have UCF over Wichita State. I have Kentucky over Missouri. I have Houston over Tulsa. I have Arkansas over LSU. I have Alabama over Mississippi State, and I have St. John's over Xavier. So those are my game picks. Before we get into the team pick or the players, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really helps the channel. I really do appreciate it. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with Kobe Jones here at the guard position for Xavier. Now, he has no games this season under 20 fantasy points, and he should get a full complement of minutes in this game. It is a tight game. I do expect his team to score in the 80s, and he's a great option on this particular slate. Obviously, he's pretty expensive, but he's one of the only guards that are averaging more than 1 fantasy point per minute. He's at 1.02. It's very unusual for many players at the guard position in college basketball to average that. So he's definitely a great option on the slate, and I definitely think he's ideal at guard position if you want to utilize an expensive guy at this position. Now, most of the players that I have at guard now are going to be value plays. I felt like the value plays for guard are really good today, and you're going to want to pay up at the forward position where there's not a lot of value. So let's go ahead and get into the value plays here. So now we have Dylan Wazoo. Sorry for butchering your name if I did. So he's not as safe as some of the other guys at his position and value, but he has just as much upside. He has had a few games under 10 fantasy points, but he is playing well, and he isn't a starter, but he comes off the bench and gets 20-25 minutes, and he doesn't need much to to pay off at this price point, and so he's definitely viable on the slate at just $4,000. And then we have Katie Johnson for Auburn, who is $3,700. I feel like this is kind of silly that he's this cheap. It's going to be pretty easy to roster Oscar Tshiebwe if you want to today, because there's guys like this. He comes off the bench as well, but he's only had one game all season long under 12 fantasy points. His price point has come down because he's coming off the bench, but he's still getting 15 to 25 minutes a game, and he's been doing really good in those games. He's averaging 0.8 fantasy points per minute. He's one of the best when it comes to that, when it comes to cheap options. So I really think he's a viable option on the slate. I think he's going to get he's going to get higher end of his normal minutes, and he definitely has the ability to pay off for you today. He's a good player. Then we're going to look at Kowalski Reeves for Florida. He's at $3,800, and he's coming off the bench the last two games, but he's still playing over 20 minutes a game. And he's been in good most of the games, regardless if he's starting or not. He did miss a couple games due to being hurt, and he only played a couple minutes because of being hurt in those games here in the middle of the year. But since he's been back back to his normal thing, and he really hasn't had any terrible games. He's only had one game, I think, under 15 fantasy points when he was actually playing a full complement of minutes, which he should too today. And this is a tough matchup for Florida, so they're going to need him to play well, and he will get the opportunity. And then we're going to look at Kyle Lofton for Florida as well. Now he's just I feel like he's been mispriced here. He's back to starting and playing a full complement of minutes. He's only had two games all season under 17 fantasy points as a starter. He started 9 games. He had a couple games coming off the bench due to coming back from his injury, but he is in a great spot here. I expect him to play well and play a lot of minutes, and I just think he's way too cheap. Again, he doesn't need much to pay off here, but if he gets in the mid-20s, that'll be amazing. So I think he's definitely viable on this particular slate. So then we're going to get the forwards here, and we're going to start with some expensive guys. We're going to start with the big guy first, Oscar Tshiebwe for Kentucky. Obviously, I am a Kentucky fan, so do keep that in mind. But he is a double-double machine. He gets a lot of rebounds, as you know, if you've ever watched him. He averages 40 fantasy points a game this season. He has monumental upside because because the offense tends to run through him. Now, I will say that the last couple games, teams have been triple teaming him, which is pretty wild to see when you're watching the game. But he's still putting up big fantasy numbers. Obviously, his price is super high, but with all the value today, you can probably find a way to fit him in there. But we have some other guys that are in just as good a shape as he is, so we're going to look at those guys here. And we're going to look at Joel Soriano for St. John's here. He's had 4 straight games over 40 fantasy points a game, over 40 fantasy points, which is pretty amazing in its own right. And he's had double-doubles in all but 2 games this season, which is actually better than Oscar Tshiebwe. And he's only had 1 game under 21 fantasy points, which is pretty amazing. So I expect him to have a big game in this matchup against Xavier, which should be a pretty tight game. And both teams are favored to score over 80 points, and they are by far the highest scoring game on the slate. He is as close to a must-play as you can get for a guy over $8,000 in college basketball. KJ Williams here for LSU also looks very interesting. He's third highest from the fantasy points per minute. He's averaging 1.2 fantasy points a minute for LSU. He's had no games under 24 fantasy points this season, and he just looks like a great option on the slate. It was, with all the value, you're going to be able to mix and match these forwards to try to find the best 3, and I think he's somebody you have to take in consideration. Then we're going to look at Jack Nunge for Xavier. He's averaging 1.07 fantasy points per minute for Xavier. He's had 2 games under 20 fantasy points. He's not as ideal as some of the other options, but he's still decent, and he's been playing well lately. He's had a couple of big games in the mid-40s, and so I think he's definitely viable on the slate. And then finally, last but not least, we're going to look at Colin Castleton. He has been absolutely dominating throughout the season. He has big-time upside here. He's had 1 bad game all season long where he had 9 fantasy points, but overall he should have plenty of opportunity in this game. This game should be a fairly high-scoring game for a SEC matchup, and I expect him to play well in it. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.